3 months after receiving my grandmother's inheritance, I never expected Sarah's parents to show up at my apartment with a lawyer, demanding half of the $280,000. Frank and Linda stood beside Mr. Patterson in my living room, presenting legal documents claiming Sarah contributed to preserving and maintaining the relationship that led to my inheritance. I stared at them in complete shock, having just proposed to Sarah 2 weeks earlier. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and stated they had evidence of Sarah's emotional and financial investment in my life during my grandmother's final years. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs, but love has a way of blinding you to the truth. Everything started 2 years ago when I met Sarah at the little coffee shop near Sunset Manor, the nursing home where my grandmother Dorothy spent her final years battling Alzheimer's disease. I was 28 then, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm in Portland, Oregon, and every Sunday I'd drive the 30 minutes to visit Grandma Dorothy. She'd raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12, and watching her brilliant mind slowly fade was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced. That particular Sunday in March, I was sitting in the coffee shop's corner booth mentally preparing for another difficult visit when Sarah approached my table. She had shoulder-length auburn hair and warm brown eyes that seemed to genuinely care when she asked if I was okay. I must have looked as exhausted as I felt. Sarah worked as a graphic designer for a small marketing firm downtown, and there was something immediately comforting about her presence. When I explained about visiting my grandmother, she listened with such empathy that I found myself opening up about Dorothy's condition, how the woman who taught me to ride a bike and helped with my homework couldn't remember my name anymore. Over the following weeks, our coffee shop meetings became a regular routine. Sarah would ask thoughtful questions about Dorothy's progress, and eventually she started joining me for visits. She'd bring fresh flowers from the farmer's market and homemade chocolate chip cookies that somehow always made Dorothy smile, even on her worst days. Dorothy took to Sarah immediately, which surprised me because Alzheimer's had made her suspicious of most strangers. But Sarah had this gentle way of talking to her, never getting frustrated when Dorothy repeated the same stories or forgot what we'd discussed 5 minutes earlier. During our visits, Dorothy would always ask about that lovely girl and when she'd be coming back. The relationship between Sarah and me developed naturally over those months. We'd grab dinner after visiting Dorothy, take walks along the Columbia River, and spend weekends exploring Portland's neighborhoods. Sarah seemed genuinely invested in my life and my family, even the painful parts. When Dorothy passed away 6 months ago, I was devastated. The funeral was small, just a few neighbors and staff members from Sunset Manor. Sarah held my hand through the entire service and helped me with all the arrangements afterward. She stayed up late helping me sort through Dorothy's belongings, listening patiently as I shared memories connected to each photograph and keepsake. The reading of Dorothy's will came as a complete shock. I knew she owned the modest 2-bedroom house where I'd spent my teenage years, but I had no idea about the extent of her savings. The house was valued at $180,000, and she had another $100,000 in various savings accounts and certificates of deposit. Dorothy had lived so simply that none of us realized she'd been carefully saving money for decades. Sarah was incredibly supportive during those overwhelming weeks of inheritance paperwork and estate management. She helped me research real estate values, accompanied me to meetings with Dorothy's financial advisor, and even suggested I take time off work to process everything properly. 2 weeks ago, I finally worked up the courage to propose. I used Dorothy's engagement ring, a simple but elegant piece she'd saved from her own marriage. When Sarah said yes, I felt like my life was finally coming together, after years of grief and uncertainty. But yesterday's confrontation shattered that illusion completely. Mr. Patterson, a thin man in his 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit, had spread documents across my dining room table like he was conducting a business meeting. Frank, Sarah's father, stood behind him with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating despite his slight build and nervous energy. Linda, Sarah's mother, kept adjusting her purse strap and shooting me disappointed glances. The legal papers were dense with terminology I didn't understand, but the basic claim was clear. Sarah's family believed she was entitled to half my inheritance because of her emotional labor and caregiving services during Dorothy's illness. They argued that Sarah's regular visits, gift-giving, and emotional support had preserved my relationship with Dorothy and directly contributed to my receiving the full inheritance. Patterson opened a manila folder and pulled out a stack of photographs showing Sarah visiting Dorothy alone, receipts for gifts Sarah had purchased, and most disturbing of all, a handwritten note from Dorothy mentioning Sarah's devotion and how much she appreciated everything Sarah did for our family. But the real bombshell came when Patterson played an audio recording on his phone. Dorothy's voice, weak but clear, was talking to someone about wanting to take care of Sarah too, because she does so much for our family. The recording was brief, but hearing my grandmother's voice praising Sarah's care made my stomach drop. Frank leaned forward and explained that Sarah had been providing unpaid elder care services that went far beyond what a typical girlfriend would do. He claimed Sarah had sacrificed work opportunities and personal time to ensure Dorothy received proper attention during her final years. Linda added that their daughter had formed a genuine bond with Dorothy and deserved recognition for her contributions. She mentioned how Sarah would call them after visits, sometimes crying about Dorothy's condition, showing how emotionally invested she'd become. The whole situation felt surreal. These people I'd thought I knew were sitting in my living room making legal claims against money my grandmother had left specifically to me. Patterson explained they weren't trying to be greedy, but they believed fairness required acknowledging Sarah's role in preserving the inheritance. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Patterson handed me his business card and suggested I consult with my own attorney. He mentioned they'd prefer to resolve this matter privately rather than through lengthy court proceedings. Frank shook my hand firmly and said he hoped I'd do the right thing for their daughter. Linda gave me a motherly pat on the shoulder and expressed confidence that once I thought about everything Sarah had done, I'd understand their position. After they left, I sat alone in my apartment staring at those legal documents and trying to process what had just happened. The woman I'd planned to marry, the person I'd trusted with my deepest grief, might have been calculating her way into my inheritance all along. The worst part was remembering all those moments I'd thought were genuine expressions of love and caring. Had Sarah been documenting every visit, every gesture, every conversation? Was she building a case while I was falling in love? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying conversations, analyzing Sarah's behavior for signs I'd missed. The proposal 2 weeks ago suddenly felt different. Had she been waiting for me to make that commitment before her family made their legal move? By morning, I realized I needed answers. The woman I thought I knew had either been manipulated by her family or had been manipulating me from the very beginning. Either way, my entire relationship was now in question, and I had to find out the truth. The next morning, I called Sarah before she left for work, asking her to meet me for breakfast at our usual place. My voice must have sounded strange because she immediately asked if everything was okay. I told her we needed to talk about her family's visit, and there was a long pause before she agreed to meet. Sarah arrived at the cafe looking nervous, her usual confident demeanor replaced by fidgety hand movements and avoided eye contact. She ordered just coffee instead of her typical blueberry pancakes, and when I brought up her family's legal demands, her reaction was more troubling than reassuring. Instead of immediate denial or outrage, Sarah became defensive. She claimed her parents were being overzealous and that she'd had no idea they were planning to involve a lawyer. But when I asked directly if she'd been visiting Dorothy without telling me, she hesitated before admitting it was true. Sarah explained that she'd started visiting Dorothy on her own because she genuinely cared about her, not because of any ulterior motive. She said she didn't tell me about the solo visits because she didn't want me to feel obligated to adjust my work schedule or feel guilty about not visiting more often. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. For months, I'd been thinking Sarah was just occasionally joining my planned visits, but she'd actually been maintaining a completely separate relationship with my grandmother that I knew nothing about. When I pressed for details, Sarah admitted she'd been visiting Dorothy twice a week during my work hours. She claimed these visits were purely social, bringing treats and keeping Dorothy company when she seemed lonely or confused. But something in Sarah's explanation didn't add up. If these visits were innocent expressions of care, why keep them secret? Why not mention the extra time she was spending with my grandmother? That afternoon, I drove to Dorothy's house to continue sorting through her belongings. In the kitchen drawer where she kept important papers, I found something that made my blood run cold: Sarah's business card with handwritten notes on the back about marketing consultation and financial organization services. The notes were in Dorothy's shaky handwriting, mentioning meetings with Sarah about planning for the future and getting affairs in order. There were dates listed spanning the past year, showing a pattern of regular consultations I'd never heard about. When I confronted Sarah that evening, she became increasingly agitated. She accused me of not trusting her and suggested that grief was making me paranoid. Sarah claimed she'd only helped Dorothy organize some paperwork because the elderly woman had asked for assistance. But Sarah's explanations kept shifting. First, she said she just visited socially. Then, she admitted to helping with paperwork. When I asked what kind of paperwork, she mentioned helping Dorothy understand bank statements and insurance policies. Each new detail felt like another piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Why would Dorothy need help understanding financial documents she'd been managing independently for decades? And why would Sarah, a graphic designer, be qualified to provide financial advice? The phone calls started that evening. Frank called my cell phone, directly bypassing Sarah entirely. He spoke in a friendly but persistent tone, explaining that their family wasn't trying to cause problems. Frank mentioned that he owned an auto repair shop that had been struggling financially, and the family was simply seeking fairness for their daughter's contributions. Linda called an hour later, taking a different approach. She spoke about how proud they were of Sarah's compassionate nature and how their daughter had sacrificed career opportunities to spend time caring for an elderly woman who wasn't even her own grandmother. Linda mentioned that Sarah had turned down freelance projects because she was committed to helping our family during a difficult time. These calls felt coordinated, like they'd planned different angles of persuasion. Frank appealed to fairness and financial need, while Linda emphasized sacrifice and emotional investment. Our dinner that night was tense and awkward. Sarah seemed caught between defending her family and reassuring me. She kept insisting that her visits to Dorothy were motivated by genuine affection, but she couldn't explain why she'd hidden them or why her parents believed those visits entitled her to inheritance money. When I asked Sarah directly if she'd ever discussed Dorothy's financial situation during their private meetings, she paused too long before answering. She finally admitted that Dorothy had mentioned her savings occasionally, but Sarah claimed she never asked specific questions about money. That pause, that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Sarah had been having financial conversations with my grandmother that she'd never mentioned to me. The next day, I took a personal day from work and drove to Sunset Manor to speak with the staff. I needed to understand what had really been happening during Sarah's solo visits. The receptionist, Mrs. Garcia, remembered Sarah well and seemed surprised that I didn't know about her regular visits. She pulled out the visitor log and showed me entries spanning over a year, with Sarah signing in as a family friend multiple times per week. Janet, one of Dorothy's favorite nurses, was even more revealing. She mentioned that Sarah had asked detailed questions about Dorothy's daily routine medications and mental state during different times of day. Janet had assumed I'd asked Sarah to gather this information, so she'd been happy to provide updates about Dorothy's good days and bad days. Most concerning, Janet remembered Sarah requesting to speak privately with Dorothy's financial advisor during one visit. She'd claimed the family was concerned about Dorothy's money management and wanted to ensure everything was being handled properly. I felt sick driving home. The woman I'd planned to marry had been conducting a systematic investigation of my grandmother's life and finances while pretending it was casual social visiting. That evening, I sat in my apartment reading through Dorothy's personal papers more carefully. Hidden in her Bible, I found a draft of a letter she'd never sent, written in her careful cursive handwriting. The letter was addressed to me and dated just 2 months before her death. In it, Dorothy expressed growing concern about Sarah's frequent questions regarding her financial situation and estate planning. She wrote about feeling uncomfortable with Sarah's persistent inquiries about whether I knew the full extent of her savings. The most devastating part came in the final paragraph. I fear she loves my money more than my grandson. There's something calculating in her eyes when she asks about my affairs that makes me uneasy. I don't want to cause problems in your happiness, but I worry about her true intentions. Dorothy had seen through Sarah's performance, but she died before warning me directly. My grandmother had tried to protect me, even from her deathbed, and I'd been too trusting to notice the signs. I spent that night reading the letter over and over, feeling the weight of Dorothy's concerns and my own blindness. The woman I'd thought was perfect had been systematically deceiving both me and my dying grandmother. Sarah's family wasn't just making a legal claim, they were executing a plan that had been in motion for over a year, and I'd been too in love to see it happening. Armed with Dorothy's letter, I knew I needed to dig deeper into Sarah's activities. The next morning, I called Sunset Manor and requested a meeting with the administration. I needed to understand exactly what Sarah had been doing during her visits and whether she'd accessed any confidential information about Dorothy's care or finances. The administrator, Mr. Williams, was initially hesitant to discuss visitor details, but when I explained the inheritance situation and showed him Dorothy's letter expressing concerns, he agreed to review Sarah's interactions with staff and residents. What I learned shook me to my core. Sarah had signed into the visitor log 43 times over the past year, always during my work hours. She'd told different staff members various stories about her relationship to our family, sometimes calling herself Dorothy's future granddaughter, and other times claiming she was helping me coordinate Dorothy's care from a distance. The nursing staff revealed that Sarah had asked incredibly detailed questions about Dorothy's medication schedule, cognitive patterns, and daily behavior. She'd wanted to know when Dorothy was most alert, when she was confused, and how her mental state fluctuated throughout the day. Most disturbing, Sarah had specifically requested to observe Dorothy's meetings with the facility's financial advisor. She'd claimed the family was concerned about Dorothy's ability to make sound financial decisions and wanted to ensure she wasn't being taken advantage of by anyone. Janet, the nurse I'd spoken with before, provided additional details that made my stomach turn. Sarah had asked about Dorothy's visitors, wanting to know if anyone else came to see her regularly. She'd inquired about Dorothy's relationship with other family members and whether she'd mentioned having other potential heirs. When I asked to see security footage from the past few months, Mr. Williams initially declined, citing privacy concerns. But after I explained the legal situation and the possibility of elder abuse, he agreed to review recordings from Sarah's most recent visits. The footage was grainy but clear enough to show Sarah in Dorothy's room, photographing documents on Dorothy's bedside table when Dorothy was napping. In another clip, Sarah was clearly removing papers from Dorothy's personal filing cabinet and examining them closely before returning them to different locations. I left Sunset Manor feeling nauseous. The woman I'd trusted completely had been conducting surveillance on my grandmother and potentially stealing sensitive information about her finances. That afternoon, I decided to check our shared laptop computer. Sarah and I had been using the same desktop for online shopping and entertainment, and I wondered if she'd left any digital traces of her research. What I found was worse than anything I'd imagined. Sarah's browser history showed extensive searches about inheritance laws, specifically focusing on proving financial contributions to elderly care. She'd researched legal precedents for caregivers, receiving compensation from estates, and had visited multiple websites about establishing claims against inherited assets. The searches weren't random or recent. They went back 18 months, almost to the beginning of our relationship. Sarah had been researching inheritance manipulation strategies before she'd even met Dorothy. I also found saved documents with detailed notes about Dorothy's daily routine medication schedule and behavioral patterns. Sarah had created a comprehensive profile of my grandmother's vulnerabilities and used that information to plan her approach. But the most damning evidence was a folder labeled Project Dorothy, containing a timeline of my grandmother's declining health, correlated with notes about her financial habits and decision-making capacity. Sarah had been tracking Dorothy's mental deterioration and timing her financial inquiries to coincide with periods when Dorothy was most confused and malleable. The folder also contained screenshots of Dorothy's social media posts, public records searches about our family's property holdings, and even newspaper clippings from Dorothy's late husband's obituary that mentioned his successful career and potential estate value. While I was processing this digital evidence, my phone started ringing constantly. Sarah's mother, Linda, called my workplace, somehow getting past the reception desk and creating a scene in the lobby. My colleague, Mark, told me Linda had been demanding to speak with me about family justice and threatening to involve the media if I didn't respond to their legal demands. Frank escalated the harassment by visiting my apartment building and questioning my neighbors about my financial situation and relationship with Sarah. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman next door, told me Frank had asked intrusive questions about whether I'd recently come into money and how I was treating my girlfriend. The family's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, sent certified letters to my home and workplace, formally demanding half the inheritance and threatening legal action if I didn't respond within 10 days. The letters included additional evidence of Sarah's contributions, including printed emails between Sarah and Dorothy that I'd never seen before. Reading those emails was devastating. Sarah had been corresponding with my grandmother, regularly discussing everything from family finances to my work schedule. The emails showed Sarah gradually steering conversations toward Dorothy's estate planning and financial security. In one exchange, Sarah had asked Dorothy if she'd considered how to ensure her family legacy would be properly preserved. In another, she'd offered to help Dorothy research the best ways to take care of loved ones through estate planning. The emails revealed sophisticated manipulation. Sarah would express concern about my financial future, wondering aloud whether I was earning enough to support a family or afford a house. She'd plant seeds of worry about my financial security while positioning herself as someone who genuinely cared about our family's future. Dorothy's responses showed growing trust in Sarah's advice and increasing reliance on her opinions about financial matters. My grandmother had started asking Sarah for input on decisions about her savings accounts and property maintenance. The correspondence painted a picture of gradual influence that had been building for over a year. Sarah had systematically gained Dorothy's trust, positioned herself as a financial advisor, and created a paper trail of her contributions to our family's well-being. That evening, Sarah tried to return to our apartment, claiming she wanted to work things out. When I confronted her with the evidence I'd found, her reaction told me everything I needed to know. Instead of shock or outrage at being falsely accused, Sarah became calculating and defensive. She didn't deny the research or the documented visits. Instead, she tried to justify them as expressions of genuine care and concern. Sarah claimed she'd researched inheritance laws because she wanted to understand her legal rights in our relationship. She said the documentation was meant to protect both of us in case anyone ever questioned her motives. But when I showed her Dorothy's letter expressing suspicion about her intentions, Sarah's mask finally slipped completely. She accused Dorothy of being paranoid and suggested that Alzheimer's had made my grandmother incapable of understanding Sarah's genuine affection. The woman I'd planned to marry was standing in my living room dismissing my grandmother's concerns and defending her manipulation as justified caution. There was no remorse, no recognition of wrongdoing, only cold calculation about how to minimize the damage to her legal case. That night, I found a hidden folder on Sarah's computer that contained the most shocking evidence yet. It was a detailed plan titled, Establishing Legal Claim to Estate Assets, with step-by-step instructions for documenting caregiver services, manipulating elderly emotions, and creating legal justification for inheritance claims. The plan included contingency strategies for different scenarios, including what to do if I became suspicious of her activities. There were detailed notes about my personality, my work schedule, and my emotional vulnerabilities following my grandmother's death. The final entry in the folder was dated 1 week before Dorothy's death. Target achieved. VD trusts me completely. Estate value confirmed at $280,000 minimum. Ready to proceed with claim once inheritance is settled. Sarah hadn't just been manipulating my grandmother. She'd been manipulating me from the very beginning. Our entire relationship had been a carefully orchestrated scheme to access Dorothy's money, and I'd been too blinded by love to see what was happening right in front of me. Sitting alone in my apartment with overwhelming evidence of Sarah's deception, I realized I couldn't handle this situation alone. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent hours researching estate attorneys in Portland. I needed someone who specialized in inheritance fraud and elder abuse cases. Ms. Rebecca Thompson came highly recommended by the Oregon Bar Association. Her law firm Thompson & Associates had successfully defended families against fraudulent inheritance claims and had extensive experience with elder abuse cases. When I called her office and briefly explained my situation, she agreed to see me that afternoon. Ms. Thompson was a woman in her 40s, with sharp intelligence and a no-nonsense approach that immediately put me at ease. After reviewing Dorothy's letter, the computer evidence and documentation from Sunset Manor, she confirmed my worst fears. Sarah and her family had been running a sophisticated inheritance scam. But Ms. Thompson also provided hope. She explained that Oregon law provides strong protections against fraudulent claims on inherited assets, especially when there's evidence of elder abuse or manipulation. The documentation I'd gathered was more than sufficient to defend against their legal claim and potentially pursue criminal charges. However, she recommended hiring a private investigator to gather additional evidence about Sarah's family and their potential history of similar schemes. She referred me to Dale Morrison, a former police detective who specialized in financial fraud investigations. Dale was a tall, weathered man in his 50s who spoke with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades building criminal cases. When I met him at his downtown office, he listened to my story with professional detachment before explaining that inheritance fraud was becoming increasingly common in Oregon. What Dale told me next changed everything. He'd actually investigated Sarah's family before 3 years ago in connection with a similar case involving an elderly man in Beaverton, whose son had been dating one of Sarah's cousins. Dale pulled out a thick file containing surveillance photos, financial records, and court documents. The family had attempted the same scheme on at least 2 other occasions targeting young men who had elderly relatives in nursing homes or assisted living facilities. The previous case involved a 25-year-old construction worker named Tyler, whose grandfather had died, leaving a modest inheritance. Tyler's girlfriend, Sarah's cousin Nicole, had claimed entitlement to half the estate based on her caregiver contributions during the grandfather's final months. That case had been settled out of court when Tyler, overwhelmed by legal expenses and family pressure, agreed to pay Nicole $15,000 to make the harassment stop. Dale suspected there were other victims who had simply paid rather than fight the claims. Dale's investigation revealed that Frank's auto repair shop was essentially a front operation. While the business did some legitimate automotive work, most of the family's income came from small-scale insurance fraud and these inheritance schemes. Frank would stage minor accidents and file inflated claims while the family targeted vulnerable families dealing with elderly relatives. Linda worked part-time at a medical office, but she spent most of her days researching obituaries, nursing home visitor records, and public property records to identify potential targets. She developed a sophisticated system for tracking families with significant inherited assets and elderly relatives in care facilities. The family maintained detailed files on dozens of potential prospects, including information about family relationships, estimated inheritance values, and emotional vulnerabilities. They'd been running this operation for years, systematically targeting grieving families when they were least able to defend themselves. Dale showed me photographs of Linda visiting multiple nursing homes, under various pretenses claiming to be researching care options for her own family while actually gathering intelligence about wealthy residents and their family situations. Most shocking, Dale discovered that Sarah had a criminal record from another state. 5 years ago in California, she'd been charged with elder abuse for manipulating an elderly woman into changing her will. The charges were ultimately dropped due to a legal technicality, but the evidence strongly suggested a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable elderly people. The family's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, was facing disbarment proceedings for filing frivolous lawsuits and had desperate financial problems due to his own legal troubles. He'd partnered with Sarah's family because he needed income and didn't care about the ethics of their schemes. Dale's investigation also revealed something that made my blood boil. Sarah had been simultaneously dating another man across town, whose grandfather was terminally ill in a different nursing home. She was running the exact same scheme on both of us, planning to claim inheritance money from whichever situation proved more profitable. The other man, a teacher named Kevin, had no idea about Sarah's relationship with me. According to Dale's surveillance, Sarah had been visiting Kevin's grandfather and asking the same detailed questions about his financial situation and estate planning. Sarah had created completely separate social media profiles and email addresses for each relationship, compartmentalizing her lies to avoid detection. She'd told Kevin that she worked different hours than her actual schedule, allowing her to maintain both relationships simultaneously. The scope of the deception was staggering. Sarah hadn't just manipulated me and my grandmother. She'd been running multiple cons at the same time, targeting vulnerable families across the Portland area. Dale provided detailed financial records showing that the family had successfully extracted money from at least 6 families over the past 3 years, totaling more than $150,000 in fraudulent inheritance claims and out-of-court settlements. They targeted families who were emotionally devastated by loss and financially unprepared for legal battles. Most victims paid modest settlements rather than endure lengthy court proceedings during their grief process. But Dale also discovered weaknesses in their operation. The family had grown overconfident and sloppy, leaving digital trails and documentary evidence that could be used against them. Patterson's legal incompetence meant their current claim against my inheritance was based on forged documents and procedurally invalid filings. Most importantly, Dale had been building a federal case against the family for mail fraud and elder abuse across state lines. My situation provided the final pieces of evidence needed to pursue criminal prosecution that could shut down their operation permanently. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had allies and a plan. Sarah's family had made a critical mistake. They'd targeted someone who was willing and able to fight back, and they'd left enough evidence to destroy their entire criminal enterprise. Ms. Thompson and Dale worked together to develop a comprehensive strategy. Instead of simply defending against Sarah's inheritance claim, we would go on the offensive, pursuing criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would protect other potential victims and recover money from previous schemes. That evening, Sarah called repeatedly, leaving voicemails claiming she wanted to work things out and warning that her family wouldn't back down from their legal claim. But her threats felt hollow now that I understood the full scope of their operation and had professional help to fight back. I realized that Sarah hadn't just betrayed my trust. She'd systematically exploited my grief and manipulated my dying grandmother for financial gain. But instead of feeling defeated, I felt empowered. I was no longer a victim. I was someone who could stop them from hurting other families. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice was finally within reach. With Ms. Thompson and Dale building our case, I thought the worst was behind me, but Sarah's family escalated their harassment campaign to new levels of desperation. Every morning brought fresh attempts at intimidation and manipulation, designed to pressure me into settling their fraudulent claim. Frank began calling my workplace daily, asking to speak with my supervisor about my family obligations, and suggesting that my employer should know about my character issues. He somehow obtained my work email address and sent lengthy messages describing their legal claim and demanding that I honor my commitments to family. Linda took a different approach, showing up at my apartment building and intercepting my neighbors to share her version of the story. She portrayed me as a wealthy, heartless grandson who was abandoning the woman who'd cared for my dying grandmother. Several neighbors mentioned these conversations, clearly troubled by Linda's emotional appeals. The harassment intensified when Frank began vandalizing my car. I'd find threatening notes tucked under my windshield wipers with messages like, "Do the right thing," and "Sarah deserves justice." One morning, I discovered my tires had been slashed, and another day, someone had keyed deep scratches into my car's paint. Sarah herself attempted a different strategy, showing up at my apartment unannounced and claiming she wanted to reconcile. She insisted that her family had forced her into the inheritance scheme and that she genuinely loved me despite everything that had happened. During this emotional conversation, Sarah claimed she'd been trying to protect me from her family's demands, but had gotten trapped in their legal maneuvering. She suggested we could elope and leave town together, abandoning both the inheritance money and her family's claims. But her performance felt hollow after everything I'd discovered. When I mentioned Dorothy's letter expressing suspicion about her motives, Sarah claimed my grandmother had been confused and paranoid due to her Alzheimer's condition. She suggested that Dorothy's concerns weren't reliable evidence of anything meaningful. Meanwhile, Ms. Thompson's investigation was uncovering new evidence daily. She discovered that the legal documents Patterson had presented contained forged signatures and fabricated dates. The supposed caregiver agreements and financial consultation contracts had been created after Dorothy's death, using information stolen from her personal files. The audio recording of Dorothy mentioning wanting to take care of Sarah had been edited to remove crucial context. Dale obtained the original recording through the nursing home's security system, which revealed that Dorothy had been expressing concern about Sarah's persistent questions regarding money, not gratitude for her care. In the full recording, Dorothy had told a nurse she was worried about Sarah's motivations and wanted to take care of the situation by speaking to me directly about her concerns. The family had manipulated her words to create the opposite impression. Dale's investigation also revealed that Sarah's family had never actually filed their inheritance claim properly with the county court system. Their entire legal threat was based on procedural errors and invalid documentation that would never hold up under judicial scrutiny. Patterson's incompetence as a lawyer meant he'd missed crucial filing deadlines and failed to meet basic legal requirements for challenging inherited assets. The family's case existed only on paper and had no legitimate standing in any court system. But Dale's most significant discovery came when he accessed Sarah's complete digital communications. She'd been secretly recording conversations with Dorothy during their private visits, trying to capture statements that could be used to support her inheritance claim. However, these recordings actually proved the opposite of what Sarah intended. They documented Dorothy's growing discomfort with Sarah's questions about money and her increasing suspicion about Sarah's true motivations. In one particularly damning recording, Dorothy explicitly told Sarah she was concerned about people who might try to take advantage of elderly individuals and their families. When Sarah pressed her about estate planning, Dorothy responded that she'd already made careful arrangements to protect her family's interests. Another recording captured Sarah asking leading questions about whether Dorothy thought caregivers deserved financial compensation for their emotional support. Dorothy's responses showed clear irritation with the topic and firm statements that family inheritance was meant for family members, not outside individuals. The recordings revealed Sarah's systematic attempts to manipulate Dorothy into making statements that could be interpreted as promises of financial compensation. But Dorothy had seen through these efforts and consistently refused to make any commitments regarding her estate. Dale also uncovered evidence of Sarah's relationship with Kevin, the other man whose grandfather she'd been targeting simultaneously. Phone records showed Sarah coordinating her schedules to maintain both relationships without detection, and financial records revealed she'd been receiving money from Kevin for grandfather care expenses that were completely fabricated. When Dale interviewed Kevin, he discovered that Sarah had been telling him almost identical stories about her financial struggles and family obligations. She'd convinced Kevin to pay for Dorothy's care expenses while telling me she was using her own money to help with Kevin's grandfather's needs. The scope of her deception included maintaining separate bank accounts for money received from each relationship and creating elaborate scheduling systems to avoid being caught with either man. Ms. Thompson used this evidence to file formal complaints with the district attorney's office, documenting a pattern of fraud that extended across multiple victims and involved federal crimes due to the interstate nature of Sarah's previous activities. The complaints included charges of elder abuse, inheritance fraud, identity theft, and racketeering based on the family's organized criminal enterprise, targeting vulnerable families. Local news stations became interested in the story after Ms. Thompson reached out to warn other families about similar schemes. A reporter from Channel 8 conducted an investigation that revealed additional victims who had been too embarrassed or intimidated to report their experiences with Sarah's family. One elderly woman in Gresham had paid Sarah's family $8,000 after they claimed her deceased husband had promised to compensate Sarah for her help with his medical appointments. Another family in Lake Oswego had settled for $12,000 when Sarah's cousin claimed inheritance rights based on her relationship with their dying mother. The news coverage prompted other victims to come forward, creating a pattern of evidence that supported federal prosecution of the family's criminal enterprise. During this period, Sarah became increasingly desperate, alternating between threats and appeals for reconciliation. She warned that her family wouldn't give up their legal claim and suggested that fighting them would cost more than settling their demands. But she also made emotional appeals claiming our relationship had been genuine despite her family's manipulation, and begging me to consider the possibility that her love for me was real, even if her motives had been complicated. These conversations felt like additional attempts at manipulation. Sarah would cry and express remorse, but when I asked specific questions about her documented deception, she'd become evasive and defensive. The truth was emerging clearly. Sarah and her family had been running a sophisticated criminal operation that preyed on grieving families and vulnerable elderly people. They'd targeted me because I fit their victim profile, and they'd systematically exploited my trust and my grandmother's declining mental capacity for financial gain. But their overconfidence and greed had led them to leave a trail of evidence that would finally bring justice for their crimes and protection for other potential victims. With overwhelming evidence of fraud and elder abuse, Ms. Thompson and Dale moved our case from defense to prosecution. The district attorney's office agreed to pursue criminal charges against Sarah, her family, and Patterson based on the documented pattern of targeting vulnerable families and elderly individuals. I was scheduled to testify before a grand jury about the systematic manipulation and exploitation my grandmother and I had experienced. The prosecutor, Assistant DA Michael Richards, explained that my case provided the strongest evidence they'd seen for this type of inheritance fraud, particularly because of the detailed digital trail Sarah had left behind. The grand jury hearing was both empowering and emotional. I presented Dorothy's letter expressing concerns about Sarah's motives, the computer evidence showing Sarah's research into inheritance manipulation, and the audio recordings documenting her attempts to pressure Dorothy into making financial commitments. Ms. Richards also presented evidence from Dale's investigation showing the family's history of similar schemes and the organized nature of their criminal enterprise. The grand jury voted to indict all 4 defendants on multiple felony charges, including elder abuse, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. The arrests happened simultaneously across Portland on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was taken into custody at her workplace. Frank was arrested at his auto repair shop, Linda was arrested at home, and Patterson was arrested at his law office, as federal agents executed search warrants on all their properties. The searches uncovered additional evidence, including detailed files on potential victims, forged legal documents, and financial records showing money laundered through fake business accounts. Linda's home office contained a wall chart tracking various elderly residents at nursing homes across the region, with notes about their family situations and estimated inheritance values. Frank's auto shop revealed evidence of the insurance fraud operation that helped fund their inheritance schemes. Investigators found staged accident reports, inflated repair estimates, and communications with corrupt insurance adjusters, who were also arrested as part of the expanded investigation. Patterson's law office contained files for dozens of frivolous lawsuits and fraudulent legal claims. His computer revealed correspondence with other criminal networks involved in elder abuse and inheritance fraud across multiple states. But Sarah's arrest provided the most satisfying moment of justice. When investigators searched her apartment, they found detailed plans for targeting additional victims, including surveillance notes on other young men with elderly relatives and financial profiles of potential inheritance targets. Sarah initially maintained her innocence, claiming she genuinely cared for Dorothy and that her family had pressured her into making inheritance claims. But faced with overwhelming evidence of her systematic deception, she eventually agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her cooperation revealed the full scope of their criminal network. Sarah provided evidence against extended family members who had participated in similar schemes in other cities' corrupt lawyers, who had filed fraudulent claims, and nursing home employees who had provided inside information about wealthy residents. The revelation led to arrests across 3 states and exposed a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been stealing from grieving families and vulnerable elderly people for over 5 years. The total amount stolen exceeded $500,000, with victims ranging from working-class families to wealthy professionals. Local media covered the arrests extensively, and Channel 8 aired a special investigative report about inheritance fraud targeting families dealing with elderly relatives. The story included warnings about common manipulation tactics and advice for protecting vulnerable family members from predatory schemes. The coverage prompted additional victims to come forward, including families who had been too intimidated or embarrassed to report their experiences. One elderly man in Vancouver, Washington, had lost $30,000 to a similar scheme involving one of Sarah's cousins, and several families in California had paid settlements to avoid lengthy legal battles. Ms. Thompson used the media attention to advocate for stronger state laws protecting inherited assets from fraudulent claims. She worked with state legislators to introduce bills requiring stricter documentation for caregiver compensation claims and enhanced penalties for elder abuse involving inheritance manipulation. The criminal trial began 6 months after the arrests. Sarah's cooperation had helped prosecutors build an airtight case against her family and Patterson, but she still faced serious charges for her role in the conspiracy. During the trial, I testified about Sarah's systematic deception and the emotional manipulation she'd used against both me and my grandmother. The experience was difficult but cathartic, allowing me to publicly expose the truth about what had happened and help prevent other families from experiencing similar trauma. Other victims also testified, creating a powerful record of the family's predatory behavior and the real harm they'd caused to grieving families across the region. Many witnesses described feelings of betrayal and violation that extended far beyond financial loss. The jury deliberated for only 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Frank was sentenced to 8 years in prison, Linda received 6 years, Patterson got 5 years plus disbarment, and Sarah was sentenced to 4 years due to her cooperation with prosecutors. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice process. Ms. Thompson also pursued civil lawsuits to recover money for victims and establish legal precedents protecting families from similar schemes in the future. The civil cases resulted in seizure of the family's assets, including Frank's auto shop, their family home, and bank accounts containing money stolen from previous victims. The recovered funds were distributed to identified victims through a court-supervised restitution process. More importantly, the successful prosecution established legal precedents that made it much more difficult for similar inheritance fraud schemes to succeed in Oregon. Courts now required extensive documentation for any caregiver claims against inherited assets, and prosecutors had clearer guidelines for pursuing elder abuse charges in inheritance cases. The case also led to policy changes at nursing homes and assisted living facilities across the state. New protocols required background checks for frequent visitors, documentation of any financial conversations with residents, and mandatory reporting of suspicious activities involving elderly residents and their assets. For me personally, the legal victory provided closure and validation that my decision to fight back had been correct. Sarah's family had targeted me because they thought I'd be easy to manipulate and intimidate, but instead, their greed had led to the destruction of their criminal enterprise and protection for countless other potential victims. The justice system had worked exactly as it should, transforming me from victim to protector and ensuring that Dorothy's memory was honored through positive action rather than violated by criminal exploitation. 6 months after the criminal sentences were finalized, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed since that shocking day when Sarah's family arrived with their fraudulent legal demands. The experience had been devastating, but it had also taught me invaluable lessons about trust, resilience, and the importance of protecting what truly matters. The immediate aftermath of the legal victory had been surprisingly complex emotionally. While I felt vindicated and relieved that justice had been served, I also struggled with feelings of betrayal and self-doubt that took time to process. I'd entered therapy to work through the psychological impact of being systematically deceived by someone I'd loved and trusted completely. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, my therapist, helped me understand that being victimized by sophisticated manipulation wasn't a reflection of weakness or poor judgment. She explained that people like Sarah and her family were skilled at exploiting normal human emotions like love, grief, and trust. Their success depended on targeting genuinely caring individuals who naturally wanted to believe in the goodness of others. Through therapy, I learned to recognize red flags I'd missed in my relationship with Sarah, not to blame myself for being deceived, but to develop better protective instincts for future relationships. The experience had made me more cautious without making me cynical, more discerning without losing my capacity for trust. The financial restitution process had recovered most of the money the family had stolen from various victims, and my legal expenses had been covered through the Victim Compensation Fund established from seized assets. But more importantly, I'd used part of Dorothy's inheritance to create something meaningful that would honor her memory and protect other families. I established the Dorothy Henderson Memorial Scholarship Fund at Portland Community College, providing financial assistance for students studying elder care social work and legal advocacy. The scholarship specifically supported individuals who demonstrated commitment to protecting vulnerable elderly people from abuse and exploitation. The scholarship program partnered with Sunset Manor and other care facilities to provide training for staff members about recognizing and reporting potential elder abuse. Recipients were required to complete internships focused on elderly protection advocacy, creating a pipeline of professionals dedicated to preventing the kind of exploitation Dorothy and I had experienced. I also donated Dorothy's house to Sunset Manor with the stipulation that it be converted into a family visiting center where relatives could spend quality time with elderly residents in a comfortable, home-like environment. The Dorothy Henderson Family Center provided a peaceful space for families to maintain meaningful connections during difficult transitions. The visiting center included resources for families dealing with inheritance planning, elder abuse prevention, and grief counseling. It served as a practical memorial to Dorothy's values, while providing tangible help to families facing similar challenges. Beyond honoring Dorothy's memory, I'd become actively involved in advocacy work aimed at protecting other families from inheritance fraud and elder abuse. I spoke at legal conferences about recognizing manipulation tactics, testified before state legislative committees about strengthening elder protection laws, and worked with law enforcement agencies to train officers about inheritance fraud schemes. Ms. Thompson invited me to join the board of directors for the Oregon Elder Protection Alliance, a nonprofit organization that advocated for policy changes and provided resources for families dealing with elder abuse. My personal experience had given me insights that helped shape more effective prevention and response strategies. The media attention from our case had also led to opportunities for broader impact. I'd been interviewed for news articles about inheritance fraud, participated in documentary projects about elder abuse, and spoken at community education events about protecting vulnerable family members. These advocacy activities had connected me with other families who had experienced similar exploitation, creating a support network of people who understood the complex emotions involved in being targeted by inheritance schemes. Many of these relationships had become genuine friendships based on shared experiences and mutual support. On a personal level, I'd gradually rebuilt my capacity for romantic relationships through therapy and self-reflection. About 8 months after Sarah's conviction, I'd met Amanda through my volunteer work with the Elder Protection Alliance. She was a social worker who specialized in elder abuse prevention, and our relationship had developed naturally from shared professional interests and personal values. Amanda's background in social work meant she understood the psychological impact of what I'd experienced and supported my continued advocacy efforts. More importantly, our relationship was built on complete transparency and mutual respect, qualities I now recognized as absolutely essential for genuine partnership. Our relationship progressed slowly and thoughtfully, with both of us committed to honest communication about our past experiences and future goals. Amanda had her own history of helping families recover from elder abuse situations, so she brought professional expertise and personal understanding to our partnership. When I eventually proposed to Amanda 18 months later, it was with Dorothy's ring again, but this time in a context of genuine love and trust that honored my grandmother's memory. Amanda understood the significance of using Dorothy's ring and embraced the responsibility of carrying forward her legacy of family devotion and integrity. The wedding ceremony included a memorial tribute to Dorothy and incorporated elements that reflected our shared commitment to elder protection advocacy. Instead of traditional wedding favors, we made donations to elder abuse prevention organizations in our guests' names. Our honeymoon included visits to elder care facilities in other states where we volunteered and learned about different approaches to preventing exploitation of vulnerable elderly people. It reflected our shared values and commitment to turning personal trauma into positive social impact. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that Sarah's betrayal, while devastating at the time, had ultimately led to profound personal growth and meaningful professional purpose. The experience had revealed inner strength I didn't know I possessed and connected me with work that felt truly important. Dorothy's inheritance had been preserved not just as financial assets, but as a foundation for ongoing advocacy that would protect other families from experiencing similar exploitation. Her money was being used exactly as she would have wanted to strengthen family bonds and protect vulnerable people from those who would take advantage of them. The legal precedents established through our case had already prevented other inheritance fraud schemes from succeeding in Oregon. Ms. Thompson regularly updated me on cases where prosecutors had used our precedent to protect families and pursue criminal charges against would-be scammers. Most importantly, I'd learned that love and trust, while they can make us vulnerable to deception, are still essential human experiences worth preserving and protecting. The solution wasn't to become cynical or closed off, but to become wiser about recognizing genuine relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. Amanda and I had started a family, and our daughter, Dorothy Marie, carried forward my grandmother's name, along with her values of integrity, family loyalty, and compassion for vulnerable people. We were teaching her from an early age about the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves and using whatever advantages we have to help others. The experience with Sarah had taught me that while some people will try to exploit kindness and trust for personal gain, the answer is not to stop being kind or trusting. The answer is to become better at distinguishing between genuine people and manipulative ones while maintaining your commitment to treating others with respect and compassion. As I finish sharing this story, I want you to think about the elderly people in your own life and the relationships you've built with them. Have you taken time to really listen to their concerns and protect them from potential exploitation? Are you paying attention to people who might be taking advantage of vulnerable family members? More importantly, how do you distinguish between genuine care and manipulative behavior in your own relationships? What signs might indicate someone is more interested in what you can provide than who you really are? I hope this story encourages you to be both trusting and vigilant, to value genuine relationships while protecting yourself and your loved ones from those who would exploit trust for personal gain. If you found this story helpful, or if you've had similar experiences, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the wisdom to recognize true love when you find it and the strength to protect it from those who would corrupt it for selfish purposes. Remember to like this story. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life experiences that can help you navigate difficult situations, and share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how inheritance fraud works and how to protect against it.